In this video, we're going to take a look at something called editable nodes. But first, for the purposes of demonstration, we're going to need to make some minor modifications to our particle controller. Basically, what I want to do is I want to make this grid an external object that comes in through an input. So if we come back out, let's just add another input to our particle controller. So right-click and go to Type Properties. Go to where it says Minimum and Maximum Inputs, and just change both of them to 2. And then let's just go to our Input-Output tab here. And where it says Subnetwork Input number 2, let's change it to emission, or let's say actually even base emission geometry, so that it implies that it's going to be modified inside the OTL. Now if we hit accept, we have 2 inputs, base emission geometry and control points. If we come back inside, we have our second input here. I'll just move it over here so that it's easy to tell which one goes where. And now that we have 2 inputs for this node, it's a little bit confusing that this just wires directly into here. So what I'd like to do is actually just create a null that tells us what each input is. So let's just go ahead and create a null. Let's color it blue with the C key. Name it control points in, and wire it into the input there. And let's just wire this guy into our null so that we know where that is. Let's create another null here. C key to color it blue. Call it emission geo in. And then let's just cut this node, Control X, and then wire our emission geo in null into the first input of the attrib transfer SOP. And then we'll wire the input of that null into our second input for the OTL. Now notice that I've crossed these wires, and you might be saying, you've broken your golden rule, you don't cross wires, right? And in this case, I think it's actually clearer if the wires are crossed. Because if the wires are crossed, then we can see input 0 and input 1 here in order. So I like that better. Okay, so if we come out of explosions here, now our second input can get wired into something. So let's just Control V to paste our grid there, and wire it into the second input. And then let's just go down to the popnet and make sure that it's still doing everything the way it was before, which it looks like it is. Okay, so let's take a look at how to use editable nodes. So if you remember, the way that this works is we just have a point that has a particular attribute on it, in this case control field, and that controls how much of an explosion we get. So really we could have any number of points that come in here from any source, not necessarily just from these OTLs, and it would still work as long as it has that attribute on it. So let's just go ahead and make another type of OTL that we can use to control this particle controller. So to create an OTL, if you remember, we start with a subnet. And this one we'll just call something cool like control matrix. And basically what this will do is it'll create a whole bunch of control points, and then we can wire that into the particle controller. Okay, so let's make our control matrix OTL. Let's right click on the subnet and say create digital asset. Remove your username from the name of the node. For now we'll not have any inputs, and then I'm just going to Control C to copy the name of the node. We'll pick a place to put it. Let's say I'll just put it there. Okay, and we'll hit accept. Then hit accept again, and it brings up our type properties dialog and makes an OTL out of control matrix. Okay, let's just hit accept for now, and then we'll have to plan out how we're going to use our control matrix. So what would be a really cool way to do this is if we could just paint where we want to have the control points be. And then the intensity will be how intense the color is that we're painting. So the way that we could set this up is if we go back to type properties and we go to the basic tab, and then we just set minimum and maximum inputs to 1. And that way we can wire in the geometry that we're actually going to paint on. In this case, it'll be our grid. And then if we go to input output, we'll just have painting, say painting geometry, or let's say geometry to paint on. And hit accept. There it is. Just pull our grid up here. We can wire it in as our input. Alright, so let's just go inside control matrix here. Let's start by adding our nulls. So create a null, make sure it's selected, hit C to color it blue, call it painting geo in, and then wire it into our input here. And there's our grid. Then we'll create our out null. So null here, call it in capitals out. Select it, hit the C key to bring up the color palette, and dark blue. Hit the C key to make it go away again. Then we'll wire the input of out into this other null. And then we'll hit the display flag there. So now we can just put all the rest of our nodes inside here. Okay, so the first thing we want to be able to do is go ahead and paint colors onto this geometry. But before we can do that, we need to actually give it an initial color, because it'll just be gray and we'll be painting some color onto gray. So what we want to do is we want to just create a point swap, and then we'll just drag it onto that wire to wire it in. We'll call this initial color. And then where it says keep color here, let's change it to add color. And then control shift click to delete the channel, and we'll just make it all black. So 0 in RGB. And then what we need to do is create a paint swap so that users can paint on there. So if we hit tab and we type paint, wire it in there. And then we'll just change the color to, let's say, red. So 0 in green, 0 in blue. And we'll call the node paint for scatter. Okay. So now if we select this node, put a cursor in the viewport and hit enter, we get this nice paint handle. Now you notice that if you click, it's really hard to get it to paint. And that's because if we hit the W key, our geometry is actually not very dense. So we have to actually click on a point to get it to color. So hit the W key to go back. The way we can do this, the way that we can fix this is just to increase the radius of our brush. So you can either go up here to where it says radius and make it bigger, but that's a little bit hard to see. So the easier way to do it is just to hold down the Alt key and then click and drag left and right. And that way you can see how much bigger it's going to get. So if we make it pretty big, we can just paint some color real fast. And then actually, the way that I want this to work is, by default at least, is we'd like it to actually accumulate. So we want to, the more we click, we want it to add more color. And that way, if we click more often, the particles will explode more. So if we change merge mode from replace to add, and let's just click this reset all changes button so that we can see that. Now if we're going to add 1, it's going to get really big really fast. We don't want that. So let's make it something like 0.2 by default. So now if I paint around, it's pretty faint, but then if I release the click on the mouse and then I start painting again and again. The more I click, the more times I click, the brighter it gets. So this way, we'll have, I'll just click a whole bunch of times here to get it in the bright spot, and then we can paint around it. So we should get 2 really big explosion points, and then a bunch of smaller kind of fading off intensities. Alright, so now we want to make it scatter. So how do we do that? Well, I'm just going to hit escape for now to get out of selection mode. And then let's add the scatter. That's a scatter SOP. And wire it in. Now it's scattered a bunch of points, and it also removed the grid. So in order to see those points, let's just turn on point display. And there they are. And notice that it's not picking up my attribute by default. What we can do to make it pick up the attribute is where it says alternate attribute here, we just enter the name of the attribute we want to use to control where the points are scattered. So what we can say is CD, capital C, lowercase d. If you remember, that's the attribute that Houdini is using for color. So that kind of worked, but we'd really rather have something that's a bit more precise. So we'd rather not have any points out here at all. So instead of learning linear interpolation here for blending algorithm, let's just change that to multiplication of probabilities. So that way when the attribute is 0, it's just going to multiply against the probability of a point being there, which makes it 0% chance. And where it's here, it's a really high chance because the attribute is really large. So we'll have really dense points there. Okay, so let's call this scatter control points. The other thing that we would like to do is reduce the number of points. Now we could just reduce this, but notice that if we go back up to the paint and we hit enter and we paint some more points, notice that as I increase the number of points outside here, the number of points inside of here decreases. And that's because there's a fixed number of points that are being scattered. So what we would really prefer here is instead of having a fixed number of points, we'd rather have it calculate the number of points. So if we go back to the scatter SOP, we can say compute number of points. We can just turn that on. And now we just have points per area. Maybe increase that a bit. Let's just say 20. Alright. And then let's just go back to our paint SOP and hit reset all changes so that by default there's no color on the grid. And I'll just hit escape in the viewport to get out of selection mode. So now if we come back out of explosions and then save operator type on our control matrix node here, and then match current definition because this is the way that users are going to be using it. Now if we dive back in, you'll notice that I can't actually use this paint SOP. Just to confirm that, if I hit enter in the viewport, you'll notice that I can't actually paint. If I try to click, it just freezes. And I still have point display on. You can see that there's no points being scattered still. So how do we allow users to actually control this node? Well, we can do that via an editable node. So if we come back out of control matrix to explosions, and then we go to our type properties dialog, and then we go back to the basic tab, you can see this editable nodes field. And this is the same thing as guide geometry. It has to be a relative path to whatever, or it has to be a node that's contained within whatever node we're currently editing. And it has to be specified via a relative path. So let's just go ahead and pick the node here. Inside here, there's our paint node. Now I can't actually use a null for this because I have to actually pick a node that users can edit inside of the node. So if we grab this paint SOP here and hit accept, you notice that it appears there. Hit accept again. It's asking me if I want to unlock the node so that it can save it, which I do. Alright. So what did that actually do? Well, if we right click and say match current definition, now if we dive in, you'll notice that none of these parameters are grayed out anymore except for these, which those were grayed out before. And now, if we select our paint sop, and then hit enter in the viewport to enter selection mode, suddenly I can modify this geometry. Okay, so you might notice that we didn't actually create the attribute that we need, which that's true. So let's go ahead and do that now. So if we come back out to explosions and right click and say allow editing of contents, go back inside, make an attribute create node, and we'll just call it control field. And if you recall, control field is actually also the name of the attribute that we need to use to control the intensity of the explosions. So let's change the attribute name to control field. And then we'll just make it 2 for now. Or actually, you notice that we have our color attribute that we can use to control the intensity of the explosions. So let's just use $CR. Alright, so let's see what that did. If we come back out, let's just not even use these guys so that we can see exactly what this one's doing. So I'm just going to unplug the merge from the control point null. And let's just plug that into control matrix. You notice now, instead of having specified points, we have a large portion of our grid that's still there. We also have these bright red spots. So let's see how that works with our actual particles. If we hit play, you'll notice that where we have bright red, they explode really high. And where we have black, they don't explode very much at all. If we just want to make this a little bit clearer. Now, here I'm going to show you a potential mistake that I make all the time and that you could make. And it's why you need to get in the habit of saving your OTLs all the time. So if I just right click here and say match current definition, you notice that everything disappears. And this node starts erroring. Why does it start erroring? Well, if we dive back inside a control matrix, our attribute create is gone. Remember to save your operator definition a lot. So I'm just going to control Z back to where it was. Now you'll notice that my control field attribute create is in here. So let's save operator type first, then match current definition. Okay, so now this node is locked again, so we can go inside, grab the paint, and let's just make a slightly wider area of very bright. In order to get them to be dense and very bright, I am just clicking a whole bunch of times. Alright, so if we hit escape and come back out, now you can see that there's a slightly bigger patch of red. Okay, so let's just go ahead and hit play and see what happens. There we go. So now where it's red, it explodes really high.